We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program the author of Eating NAFTA, Trade, Food Policies, and the Destruction of Mexico. She is a professor of Latin American and Latino Studies at City University of New York and an anthropologist by training. Alicia Galvez, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So obviously, our relationship with Mexico has been in the news. Trade has been in the news. Recently, Donald Trump, I guess, tentatively renegotiated NAFTA. Let's just start with the question of why approach NAFTA and this relationship between Mexico and the United States from the perspective of food and eating?
Well, it's one of the ways that trade gets to us, really. It's one of the most direct ways that our lives are impacted by trade deals. Most of us are not, dealing in chips or circuitry or car parts or airplane parts, but all of us eat. So it's one of the best ways that we have to kind of see how these things operate.
And so is that particular in terms of our relationship with Mexico? I mean, or is it particularly with our relationship with Mexico?
Yeah, it's not exclusive with Mexico, but there's no country that we have a closer relationship to in terms of our food systems. So I live in New York City, and, much of the fresh fruit and vegetables that I eat comes from Mexico and a few other trading partners. We also get stuff, obviously, from Chile and from New Zealand and things like that. But there is a lot of the produce that gets consumed in the United States is coming from Mexico. And they're consuming a lot of our commodity grains. A lot of the corn and soy and wheat that gets produced in the United States is being consumed on the Mexican side in the form both of processed foods and beverages, but also animal feed, which is contributing to a large growth in terms of the market for meat.
So, all right. So let's let's go back and give us a little bit of the sort of the pre-NAFTA history, I guess, and then we'll go into NAFTA, because that dynamic of this exchange of food is largely a function of NAFTA in many respects.
Right. Well, NAFTA is really a product of the thinking of a few mainly University of Chicago educated economists who were operating in all three countries. So Mexico's economic policymakers typically have studied in the University of Chicago, as have U.S. policymakers and Canadian as well, I assume. And we have a Milton Friedman motivated orientation towards the free market, towards taking down barriers to trade in the interest of the expansion of capitalism, that, really comes to dominate thinking about economic development and economic policy in the 20th century. And that thinking, basically prefers foreign direct investment, taking away any sort of barriers to cross-border trade, getting rid of tariffs and subsidies and things like that, so that capital and goods can flow freely across borders. That sort of thinking was so dominant that, Margaret Thatcher famously said at one point, there is no alternative. This is kind of the economic model that Reagan-Thatcherism produced. And we see it turning into very concrete policy proposals. So NAFTA is one of those policy proposals, and the idea is to sort of knit together the three countries of North America into a single economic market. Unlike, other examples we can think of, like the European community that took away barriers to the circulation of people, we never really had a serious conversation about taking away barriers to people. But we did try to take away barriers to goods and capital to try to create a single unified market. And that was where NAFTA came from.
And we should say this was a long-time libertarian a policy agenda in many respects. This internationalism. This is, one of the things I think that came out of Pellerin was this notion of bringing down these barriers to capital, and on some level, sort of fighting against the sovereignty of nations, at least in this respect, right? It's
Yeah.
and I think actually we interviewed someone about it. We're looking for the name right now, but this was a long-term agenda, and in many respects, NAFTA was a it wasn't the culmination. It was one of the culminations, I guess. And so,
Yeah, absolutely.
So this, all right. So this dynamic. I mean, this is really fundamentally the issue, isn't it? Or is it that there is a disequilibrium in terms of what can cross borders easily and what can't, or who can't?
Yeah. Well, there are a few problems, and maybe because I'm not an economist, maybe because I'm an anthropologist, I'm able to see some of those problems in ways that they're visible perhaps to me in ways that they aren't to other disciplines, because there are some sort of taken for granted mantras within this sort of thinking that I find a little bit hard to understand and hard to believe. So one of them is the idea that what NAFTA is free trade. And if we, kind of look at what free trade is supposed to be, it's supposed to be getting rid of barriers to trade, getting rid of subsidies, anything that kind of artificially gets in the way of the market doing its thing. But if we look at NAFTA, NAFTA was never a free trade agreement in spite of its name. The United States never got rid of its subsidies. We still famously, pay farmers to grow corn, whether we need corn or not, to grow wheat, to grow commodity soybeans, et cetera. And so we have a market that's already not a free, marketplace where supply and demand are determining everything. So that's one thing. Another idea that's very sacred in this sort of thinking is the idea of comparative advantage. And this is the idea that, if one place is good at something, they should do all of that thing, and other places. So if the U.S. is good at corn, the U.S. should produce all the corn for everybody who wants corn, and nobody else should bother because they can't do it as well as the United States can. And so maybe Mexico can build airplanes and work on car parts and leave the corn growing to the U.S. This is a very central idea to NAFTA, and it's part of the reason why NAFTA is such a problem for public health and Mexican culture and for the health of people in the United States as well. Because basically, not all corn is the same. The commodity corn that we grow in Iowa is not edible. It's not sustainable in the same way that heirloom corn, landrace corn is in small-scale farming in Mexico. It can't be eaten the same way. It can't be used the same way. It doesn't have the same symbolic or cultural value. So there's this idea of sort of equivalence that gets constructed that's really not very logical or coherent. Then related to that, sorry.
Okay, well, you know what? I mean, I want to just flag that because I want to return to that dynamic. I think it's really important to talk about. But continue, and we'll come back around to that.
Yeah, no, just related to that, and this may be what you're thinking about, is the idea of efficiency. And again, I'm not an economist, but my understanding of efficiency is that it's a ratio. It's you look at what you put in and you look at what you get out, and if you get a lot out for what you put in, then something is it's a pretty good deal. It's a pretty good effort. And when we look at corn, part of the logic for the United States growing everybody's corn is the idea that the U.S. is more efficient at growing corn, and that Mexican small-scale subsistence farming is inefficient. But again, if we think about the ratio, we have to think about what's going in and what's coming out. And to get the incredibly massive yields per hectare that we get in U.S. commodity corn, we have to look at all of the inputs. We have to look at the patented corn the seeds. We have to look at the chemicals. We have to look at Roundup that's being sprayed on the crops. We have to look at the $1 million tractors. We have to look at the administrative wings of most farm operations where they're, applying for and administering the subsidies that are coming from the federal government. Investment. If we look at small-scale subsistence farming, oftentimes the plots of land are so small and irregular that you can't even have a tractor. It makes no sense to have a tractor. They might be rain-fed or they might be irrigated partially. The seeds are saved from one year to the next, so nobody is, making a profit. Seeds are not intellectual property. Very few chemicals are often used. And so we see, yes, very small yields, but there's very little that's going into that production. And in fact, it's damaging the environment far less than, the much more chemically intensive production.
All right. Well, so I want to go back. Let's just go back over that. I want to talk first, just to go back to the idea of free trade, and that and I will say that there are economists who make the point. Dean Baker comes to mind, who says these aren't free trade. I mean, we hear that and whether it's TPP or this, it's not really free trade. It's just a word that's associated with it, and it sounds good. But I mean, and you're not an economist, but are there examples even of free trade? I mean, is it? I mean, I guess maybe in the context of the European Union, within the context of it. You see free trade there, but I mean, we don't.
But they're also
maybe not even
into
there.
Consideration. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can't point to any. Because I mean, it can lead to some cruelties. There are harsh aspects to the market. You can have people plant and earn nothing, and you can have people grow more than the market wants and go bankrupt. There's a lot of unpredictable factors. I'm not an expert in this, but part of the reason we have subsidies is to try to smooth those things over. But what we end up having is a very hybrid system that's protecting some. The interests of some are being protected, and some are being insulated from exposure to risk, while others are bearing all the risk. And that's the point of my book, really, is that there are the little guy in all three countries is bearing more of the risk. This rhetoric about Mexico winning and the U.S. losing is a false rhetoric, because it's working people in all three countries that are losing. It's people who are vulnerable to the vagaries of the market, who have feast or famine situations in terms of the jobs available to them. And, we're left with the crumbs after everything else has sort of been sorted out by the power brokers, who are the 1% and the corporations who are really managing these situations to their own benefit and for their own profit motives in all three countries. But it's working people who are left with a really miserable situation, and that's the losing and the winning that we have to be attentive to.